Hi everyone, and welcome to episode 2 of Beyond the Surface. Just want to say an absolutely massive thank you to everyone who listened to the first podcast and all the people who commented on social media and the people who reached out through DMs to speak about experiences they've had and other people seeking advice. So really great engagement and positive feedback. So I thank you all for that, and I hope you enjoy this episode. Okay, here's a disclaimer. Before we start, you're going to hear about some extremely dangerous diving practices, including diving to 70 meters on air with no backup. I did this when I was a recreational diver. I was young, I was stupid, and I was doing things way beyond my training level. Recreational scuba diving training doesn't cover extreme depths like this, and we were extremely fortunate no one was hurt or killed. So don't try this at home, kids. As a kid, there's nothing quite like hearing the sound of two Rolls-Royce Spey engines in full afterburner, roaring and rumbling through your body as you're sat in class trying to listen to the teacher speak. There's an even better feeling knowing that fully loaded 20 tons of screaming death is piloted by your dad. I grew up around fighter jets, with my dad a fighter pilot in the RAF. Most of my upbringing was in Germany, with some in UK, some in the Middle East. My outlook on life was quite simple. You joined the squadron your dad was on, you worked in the NAFI, you were a teacher, or you were a German. Life on the base didn't really set me up for civilian life, so I was carted off to boarding school, where, after one misadventure too many, I was expelled. I remember the end of every term dreading going home, because I knew that my report card was going to say exactly the same thing it said the year before or the term before, which was, Stuart's intelligent enough to do the work, but he chooses to use his intelligence in other ways. And seeing the disappointment on my mum and dad's faces as they read the detailed report. I come from a long military background. My great-grandfather was in the horse-drawn artillery. He was 15 when he signed up. He lied about his age, and he was off fighting war at 15. Both my grandfathers were in the RAF. I had uncles in the RAF. I had one uncle who was a search and rescue winchman in the Fleet Air Arm. I've had cousins in the Commandos, brothers in the Army and the RAF, cousins in the RAF. You could say we've given a lot for the country. So it was obviously going to be no surprise that I joined the forces and I joined the Royal Engineers in the Army. After a short time in the Army, I injured myself and had to be medically discharged. They said, leave for a year, recuperate and rejoin. But when I left, I knew that I probably wasn't going to go back. I remember phoning Dad afterwards, after I'd come out the Army, and saying to him or asking him what civilians did, what do I do now? Because I had no plan outside being in the military. And he said, well, Stu, you can do whatever you like. The world is your oyster, except that I didn't know what I wanted to do or where I was going to go. So I bummed about for a few years. I had a few jobs here and there. I worked in Tesco's. I worked in a quarry. I did loads of different jobs. And I ended up in my mid-20s or early 20s in Edinburgh, partying, DJing, and I even did a stint as a podium dancer, but that's probably not a story for here. By this point in my life, Dad had gone out to Oman to fly for the Sultan's Air Force over there, teaching weapons and tactics to their pilots, sort of like a posh Top Gun in the desert. It was good for me because I used to go out there on holidays and they lived on a small island, and that's where I learned to scuba dive. Dad had come back from the Middle East and seen the state of me. I was kind of pale. I was kind of, I wouldn't say emaciated, but I was certainly thin, and I wasn't looking very great, having, most of my nights up partying, DJing, and being out all the time. And he said, look, we need to do something with you. You need to get out of this situation. He had a friend who lived in Dubai, and he had a friend who had a diving school, and they were looking for staff. So they said, basically, look, you can come out, work for us. We're not going to pay you very much. And we know you've done a bit of scuba diving, so we can teach you. We can put you through your advanced scuba, your rescue, rescue diver, dive master, and then ultimately you can become a scuba diver. So that's what I did. I went out to the Middle East, and we were about 2 hours away from Dubai over the east coast through the mountains, a place called Khor, and I went there and I learned to dive properly. I learned to teach people diving, and it was really good. And we had quite a few days where we didn't have customers, and because we were young and stupid, what we decided to do was we'd go out to the shipping lane, find the deepest spot we could, throw the anchor over, and do a quick deep dive. Now, I mentioned in the first podcast about nitrogen narcosis, which is when you're diving, the nitrogen becomes narcotic under pressure, and the deeper you go, the bigger the effects. If you descend rapidly, the effects are more pronounced, and so that's what we used to do. And on this one time, we'd taken our dive master out, a young guy called Chris Binney. I think he was about 18 at the time, and he said he wanted to do a deep dive. So me and my mate Gav said, okay, well, let's do it. We'll take you down. We want you to stop at 50 meters, because 50 meters, you're going to be pretty frazzled because of the nitrogen. We'll continue down to the bottom, which was on this dive 70. You hang about 50. We'll go down, we'll come back, and we'll take you up to the surface. So that was all planned. Crispin said, yep, great, no problem at all. And we did the dive. We bombed down as fast as we could. We got to 50 meters. We told Crispin to hold on the line. And he did. And we continued to bomb down to 70. Now, being at 70 meters while breathing air on a single tank isn't safe. So I wouldn't suggest anyone do it. But we were young at the time and we didn't think anything of it. So we get down to 70 meters. We're both pissing ourselves laughing because we're euphoric and we're completely off our faces on nitrogen. I remember looking at my dive computer and trying to work out how long I had down there before I had to do decompression stop. I eventually worked out that it was 2 minutes I could stay down there without having to do any deco stop, so I could come straight back up to the surface. I remember hearing a clicking sound, and I thought it was dolphins. And every time I stopped breathing, the clicking would stop, and I'd look around. Gab was sort of looking at me, puzzled. And then I realized it wasn't dolphins, it was my regulator clicking in and clicking out. And it was quite funny. I remember looking at my contents gauge and trying to read my contents gauge. And what I worked out in the end was, okay, well, there it's going to be red, and over here it's green. So red is bad, green is good, and I was somewhere in between, so I knew I had enough in my tank. I looked up at one point and I saw this silhouette floating down towards me, arms and legs flailing. And what it was, Crispin had decided he was going to go up to 55 meters, down to 55 meters, sorry. And he got to 55, and then he says he doesn't know what happened. And he came down, he lost all control, all motor skills, all control of his arms and legs. And he came down, and he came down, and he came down, and he hit the ground, the seabed in front of me and Gav, and let out this big Wile E. Coyote type dust cloud, which had me and Gav in absolute fits of giggles. At that point, I realized we're near the no decompression limit. So we picked Crispin up and took him back up to the surface. When he got to about 50 meters, he regained control of himself and he was able to ascend safely. But had he done that on his own, it would have been a completely different outcome. Gav and I had made quite a few friends in Dubai with other divers, and we met some commercial divers who said they were offshore earning what to us was a king's ransom. And so we asked, how do we get into that? How do we get into this scene? And they said, well, you need to do some training. Gav and I had been told about a chap called Bob Falcon near Abu Dhabi, who ironically had a diving outfit somewhere in the desert. He was looking for a couple of blokes for a small inshore job, and we drove 2 hours towards Abu Dhabi from Dubai to find his yard. When we got there, we thought we'd had the wrong place because it was a walled yard with junk everywhere and two rabid-looking Dobermen barking at us while we sat in the Jeep. After sitting there for a while, we picked up enough courage to get past the dogs and went into the porter cabin and were ushered in by a lovely Indian chap who was about 4 feet tall. And we were shown through to the back office to meet Bob. At first glance, looked like a cross between Kenny Rogers and a Russian gangster. But the image was shattered when he opened his mouth, and he was actually rather polite and well-spoken. And we sat down in front of him. We were wearing board shorts and flip-flops and vests. And he looked at us puzzledly and said, "So what can I do for you boys?" We said, "Oh, we're commercial divers and we just wonder if you got any work." And he took one look at us and he knew exactly what we were, and commercial divers wasn't it. And so he asked, "Have you got CVs?" And I'd heard about CVs before, but I didn't really know what one was. I was like, "Oh yeah, of course we've got CVs. We just don't have them with us. But we've got CVs and certificates, and yeah, we'll get them to you. But have you got any work for us?" So that's how we got our start. He basically said, "Look, I've got some harbour swims to do. We've got a French warship coming in. We need to check the seabed, check there's nothing sticking up, nothing going to impede its progress into the harbour. So if you can do a seabed swim there, that would be great." So we did that job. And we did a couple of other jobs in Sharjah in UAE, doing the same sort of thing, but in the creek. And then we moved on to some slightly bigger jobs. At this point, we had thought we'd really made it, because Bob had upped us from $100 a day to $120 a day. And he said, "Look, there's a job in a desalination plant called Tawila, and the job is to put in some blocks, 12 blocks in staggered form, attached to 36-inch flanges with some Johnson screens on top of them." A Johnson screen is a big screen, like a big mesh cylinder that goes on top of a flange, which is on a block. Flanges, for those of you who don't know, are just basically connecting joints between two pipe sections. And then it sucks in seawater up the 36-inch pipe and into the desalination plant. So we had to put these 12-ton blocks in a staggered fashion into this culvert, and a culvert's like a concrete water inlet. But we hadn't done it before. We had no idea what we were doing. Bob had given us some dodgy kit. We had a compressor that only pumped to 90 bar, so your diving cylinders should be pumped to 200 bar, and we were just diving on scuba. What we should have had was a proper dive team. Supervisor, 2 divers, standby diver ready to go if something went wrong, and a tender managing our lines and equipment from the surface. We should have had diving helmets with voice comms to talk to the surface, umbilical supplying air from a proper compressor, safety harnesses, underwater cameras so the supervisor could see what we're doing. Instead, we had 2 guys with scuba tanks that were barely half full, no backup, no communication, and no one even knew where we were most of the time. But Gav and I didn't know better, so we just went there, turned up in our board shorts, and made it up as we went along. Now, still to this day, that's one of the biggest engineering jobs I think I've been on, given that we had no procedures, we didn't really know what we were doing, we were just making it up. And if you go onto Google Earth, you can actually see that structure from a satellite image. So the structure we put in, you can see from space, basically. We used to come straight from the nightclubs and go to work. And so suffice to say, we were pretty worse for wear. What we used to do, we used to go inside the flanges, which were on top of these blocks. We'd go in, through, up, and then up into the 36-inch pipes we'd installed. And we'd inflate our BCDs, which are buoyancy control devices. And so the top half of our bodies were out of the water, and the bottom half of the bodies were in the water. And that way we could have a snooze for an hour or two, and everyone thought we were underwater doing work. One day, Gab was in the water doing some work. I was on top of the water, asleep in a pipe. I was actually on the surface. I hadn't gone up through. I'd just gone into a pipe and I was dozing. Had a chap wearing full PPE, so safety glasses, hard hat, overalls, safety boots, came up and said to me, woke me up and said, are you one of the divers? I said, "Yeah, that's right." And he said, "Well, where's your supervisor?" And I said, "Well, I'm the supervisor today. What do you need?" And he said, "Well, where's your diver? Where's your dive team?" And so I got on my pipe. I looked over and I pointed to some bubbles and I said, "Well, he's over there, tightening up a flange." And he said something about a risk assessment, supervision, and then grumbled and walked off. So I didn't really think anything of it. And then Gav came out of the water and I told him, I said, some bloke was here and he was looking for the dive team. And he said, well, we're here. And I said, I know. And he said he was looking for a risk assessment. And Gav said, what's a risk assessment? I'm like, no, absolutely no idea. Which a risk assessment is something you do before every job to see what the hazards are, see how to mitigate the hazards. And it's an integral part of planning off the job. And because we had no training, we had absolutely no idea. I don't know how we didn't die many times over on that job, but we lived to tell the tale. One of the jobs that they'd given us at the power plant was to swim up a culvert, and this culvert was completely enclosed. It was like a tunnel underwater. There was no air gap at the top, and what they wanted us to do was they wanted us to swim, or in our scuba, go all the way up this tunnel and go and check the seals on the doors at the end. And we didn't really think anything of that. We measured it and it was about 200-300 meters. And so we thought, well, we could probably make that there and back on a single tank. And so we put our scuba on, we swam up this tank, we got to the end, checked around the seals, and made our merry way out again. Didn't really think anything of it. There was no backup. There was no backup plan. There was no rescue divers. It was just me and Gav. And then they said, well, there's another one next to this, but it's open. There's water flowing through it. So you're not going to be able to swim up it because the current's going to be too strong. So what we'd like to do is we'd like to put you in on a crane. I didn't have any diving basket or anything. We were just standing on a crane hook. And they said, we're going to put you in through this manhole. Is that fine? And we said, yeah, absolutely fine. We can do that. And you can go and check where the doors will come down to seal. And then afterwards, you can just go through the culvert and get out the other side. And so we thought, yep, no problem at all. We'll get in, we'll do that. So we went in, we got lowered in by the crane through this manhole into this flowing water. We were able to hold ourselves against the shuttering and not get swept away while we checked the seals. Having checked the seals, the plan was just to go through the pipe and go with the flow and get out of the tunnel. And so we did that. And I need to point, we didn't have any torches. We just had our diving gear. And as we got swept into the tunnel, I remember it getting darker and darker and darker and holding on to Gav. And we were spinning around and I couldn't tell which way was up or down. I had absolutely no sense of direction. And there was nothing to reference against because it was completely pitch black. And I suddenly had the thought, well, what if there's an obstruction in this pipe? What if there's some sort of grating or some shuttering that they haven't told us about? If we come up against that, we will be dead. There's no way for me or Gav to swim against the current and swim back up there. And if we did, there's no way for us to get out because they put the manhole cover back across. So for what seemed like an eternity, we just held on to each other. And I remember at one point seeing a small little pinprick of light that was moving around and then disappearing. And then it was getting bigger and bigger and bigger. This small glow becoming a blue glow and then a bright green glow. And I remember coming out into the light. It was like being reborn again. And we both went off to the side, climbed up the rock dump, sat on the rock dump, didn't say a word to each other. Gav went to his Jeep, which was parked just up the way, came back with a pack of Marlboro Lights. I smoked at the time. He lit two, gave one to me. He sat there smoking these cigarettes. And I looked at him and I said, well, that wasn't very good, was it? And he just went, no, mate, let's not do that again. So after nearly killing ourselves several times, we decided it was probably quite a good idea to go and get some proper training. Now, luckily for us, the rand was really weak against the pound at that point in time. And so going to do our diving training in South Africa was going to be relatively cheap compared to the UK. So I scrabbled together a little amount of money that I'd managed to save from doing these jobs for Bob. and went to the bank of Dad and asked if I could take out a loan. Got the money together, signed up for the course, flew off to South Africa, and went and learned to dive in South Africa. So off we went to South Africa, Gav and I, to do our commercial diver training at the Professional Dive Centre in Durban. The first part of the 10-week course was the commercial scuba diving, where you're learning to use full face masks and tanks on your back, and you're not connected with an umbilical to the surface. The next 4 weeks was the surface supply section of that, where you're learning how to use diving helmets. In our case, it was the Kirby Morgan 17, which is a hard-shelled epoxy helmet, and they come in stainless steel as well. And that has communications up to the surface. You've got an umbilical attached to your harness, which contains your air, your communications, and there's a camera on top of your head, and that gets fed up to a supervisor who's supplying you with gas and supervising your dives. Then the last part of the course was what's called a top-up for surface supply, and that's using a wet diving bell, where two of you go down in a diving bell, and you're both supplied with a main umbilical, and then inside the bell are an umbilical each for you and your diving companion. One of the diver goes out, the other one feeds him as his umbilical, and then the second diver can also come out as well. The diver training in South Africa was absolutely fantastic. Had an absolutely amazing time there. The training was first class, and we returned to Dubai with our Class 2 South African diving certificates. Having had worked for quite a few months at the desalination plant, we already had quite a bit of experience, even though it wasn't the right experience. Now we had what we thought was the right experience. We thought we were ready to take on the commercial diving world. And so we went to see a chap called Mark Seven, who was working for a company called Smith at the time. He's the operations manager. Presented ourselves to the office and said, "Hi Mark, we're baby divers, we're looking for work." He told us there are no such things as baby divers. A diver's just a diver, and he would give us a job 2 months straight offshore. Now, I thought I was ready for offshore diving. And when I got there, I did feel like a fish out of water. There's all sorts of terms and terminology that I had no idea about. Everybody seemed to know where they should be, and I didn't. In fact, my first series of dives were so bad that I thought I'd made a mistake. I remember going up to Chopper, our lead diver, and saying, "Look, Chops, this Australian diver, I really think I've made a mistake here. I don't think I'm in the right place." And he told me, "Don't worry about it. It's your first week. You're not going to know everything, where everything is, what all the things are. Dig in and you'll be fine." So my first dive was not too deep, and it was to take off a semi-floating subsea hose off a plem. A plem is a pipeline end manifold, and what it is, there are two flanges, which is a mating face between two pipes, one on one end, one on the other end. Now, the job that I had to do was take bolts out of this semi-floating hose, separate them, and we were going to put a new hose on. The hoses are quite large, there's a lot of movement in the water, and I'd got most of the bolts out, and there was still one bolt right at the 12 o'clock position at the top of the flange. I told the supervisor that I think we're going to have to get a lift bag on this, take some weight off the floating hose, and I'll be able to get the final bolt out. Now, bearing in mind this was my first offshore dive, I was pretty keen to please. The supervisor said, "Okay, Stu, just wait there, don't do anything, hang about, we'll get a lift bag sent down to you." Now, lift bag is ostensibly a big balloon. You attach it to whatever you need to lift, and you put some air into it, and it just makes whatever you're trying to lift buoyant, so it picks it up a bit. So I was waiting for that, and I thought, if I time this, I can probably go with the swell, get my shoulder underneath it, and I can lift the hose off, no problem. And, I'll be pretty pleased with myself. So I did that. I put my shoulder underneath it, waited till the swell was just lifting it up a bit. It lifted it up. I tried to pull the bolt out, and as it came out, the swell came down again, and it scraped along this flange face. Now, this is a machine flange face, machined to a very high tolerance. So as it scraped down, it left a big gouge down the front of the flange face. And the supervisor immediately said, "Stu, what the fuck is that?" I froze. And I said, "Oh, there's just a little mark down the flange face." And he said, "Well, can you feel it with your finger?" So I rubbed it with my finger and I could feel it. And he intimated to me that my first dive could be my last dive, because if the subsea hose that was put on the end of that didn't seal properly, then they may have to replace the whole plem. I came out of that dive feeling very sorry for myself and wanting to make it up on the next dive. The next dive was a deep dive down to 40 meters. As I was descending down, I could feel my breathing getting tighter and tighter. And so what usually happens is, as you're going down, the pressure increases. So there's a thing on the surface called a Tesco, which is a regulator, and it regulates the amount of air that goes down your umbilical to you. That had been set at surface pressure. And so as I went down and my breathing got tighter, it should have been opened up to give me a bit more air. I wasn't thinking that at the time. I was just thinking, I can't breathe. And I started to panic a bit as I got down to 40 meters, bearing in mind I was a bit narked. The nitrogen narcosis was affecting me, and I didn't even think to open up my secondary air, which is the normal procedure. So you've got a scuba tank on your back, it's called your bailout. Just crack open your bailout, and you've got pressurized air again. So I said to the supervisor, I said, I can't breathe. And he said, oh, sorry, Stu, I haven't opened up your Tesco. He opened it up, I could breathe again, everything was fine. So I came out of that dive feeling a bit foolish also. Now, my third dive, I was extremely keen again to please, being a baby diver. And this job was putting a clamp on one of the legs of the rig we were working on. And so to put the clamp on the side of the rig, what we needed to do is we had these big Kevlar straps. The Kevlar straps wrapped around the circumference of the leg, and they were pulled together with there was two stainless steel cylinders that sat in the ends of the Kevlar, and there was a threaded rod that goes between them. And as you wind up the threaded rod, it pulls the cylinders towards each other and it tightens the Kevlar and sucks the clamp in to the leg. So that's what I was doing. Again, we were quite shallow, so I think I was in the water for 2 or 3 hours. I got this thing buttoned up, very pleased with myself, and the supervisor said, "Okay, Stu, your time's up, you can come back to the vessel." So I started finning back towards the vessel. I probably got about 5 meters, 6 meters, and then I stopped. I couldn't go any further. And so I said to the supervisor, I said, "Okay, I will stop on my umbilical. I'm just going to go back to the leg. I think it's caught around something." And as I went back to the leg, to my horror, I saw my umbilical was bar tight in between the Kevlar strap and the leg of the rig, which meant I wasn't going anywhere very soon. I told the supervisor, he said, "Okay, go and undo the threaded bar, let it drop away, free your umbilical." So basically the work that I had done on that whole dive was undone because I had to let everything fall away and free my umbilical and come back to the boat. When I came back, I went back up to Chopper, the lead diver, and I said, "Look, Chops, this really isn't going well, you know." And he said, "Stu, don't worry about it. It's absolutely fine. It's only your third dive. You'll get it together." So there's me offshore, third dive, thinking I've made the biggest mistake of my life. Maybe this life isn't really for me. We were hanging around on deck after one of the dives, and Chops told me to go and get some bagging. Now, bagging in diving parlance is a bit of hose. And so he pointed over to the side of the boat and said, "Go and grab that bagging and bring it over here." So I went over to the side of the boat and I was looking for bags. In my mind, bagging was bags. So I was looking for bags. I went back over to Chopper and I said, "Look, there's no bags over there. No bagging over there, mate." And he went, "Stu, just go over there. Just bring the bagging over. Stop fucking around." So I went over there. I was looking around again, picked up the hoses, looked underneath them. No bags. Go back to Chopper. Chopper, there's no bags, there's no bag in there, I can't find anything. And he literally walked me over, picked up the hose and went, Stu, mate, this is bagging. All these terms and terminology were new to me. And that first week really was a baptism of fire. After about week 3, I was getting into the swing of things. I was feeling much more comfortable. I'd done quite a few dives and I was feeling good about everything. And we had a bit of bad weather. And so we had a bit of downtime. And so we were just chilling out, watching movies on the old VHS tapes and that sort of stuff. One of the evenings that we were down in weather, Chopper came up to me and said, Stu, I need to ask you a serious question. I said, what is it, mate? And he said, have you got any alcohol on board? Because Chopper had been really good to me, I didn't want to lie to him. And I wasn't sure what sort of trouble I was going to get into, but I had stashed away a bottle of whiskey. And I said to him, I may have. And he said, okay, well, let's show me where it is. Come and show me. So I went to my cabin. I lifted up my mattress. Underneath my mattress, there's a cubby hole thing. So I lifted up the wood covering that and took out a 3-litre bottle of J&B whiskey. Chops gave me a stern look and said, we're going to have to go and see the offshore manager in his cabin. And so I was shitting in. I thought, I've finally gotten into my stride. I've been found out that I've got booze offshore. I'm in deep shit. So off we went to the OM's cabin. As we approached the cabin, I could hear AC/DC coming out of the cabin. And as I opened the cabin door, the rest of the diving crew was in there with the OM, and they all had drinks in their hands. And I walked in with my 3-litre bottle of J&B, and Chopper said, I told you he wasn't a wanker. So I guess what I'm getting at is that when you first get on your first job, you aren't going to know everything. You are going to make mistakes. You won't know all the terms. How could you? Theodore Roosevelt is attributed to have said, the man who makes no mistakes will never make anything. We learn from our mistakes. I've made many, many mistakes, and hopefully I've learned from them. So when you get out there, don't be afraid to make the mistakes. Don't be afraid to ask the questions. Make the mistakes, learn from them, and you'll grow. Thanks for listening to the second podcast. Really appreciate you listening if you got all the way through to the end. If you are looking to get started in the offshore industry, then you can go to our school.com community where there's a forum and there's all sorts of lessons on there. The link is in the bio, so please go and have a look at that. If not, look forward to seeing you on episode number 3.